Dr. J. Raj's Literary Lens presents Part 1, After Theor, Lecture 6, Minority Studies Theory. This lecture is prepared and presented by Dr. S. Joseph Arul J. Raj, former Head and Associate Professor of English, St. Joseph's College, Autonomous, Tiruchirappalli, Tamil Nadu, India. The United States and many other societies are made up of many different people. Some of these groups, based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, disability, or language, have historically been excluded from power, resources, and mainstream cultural narratives. Minority studies theory is the collection of ideas that scholars use to study those exclusions and to imagine more inclusive futures. Minority studies theory grew out of several intellectual traditions: critical race theory, feminist theory, postcolonial theory, and cultural studies. While each tradition has its own vocabulary, they all share a concern for power, voice, and representation. By bringing these traditions together, minority studies theory offers tools for a. Analyzing how dominant societies construct normal identities and label others as different. b. Understanding how multiple forms of oppression intersect, for example, race plus gender plus language. c. Highlighting the knowledge, cultures, and resistance strategies that marginalized peoples create for themselves. Minority studies theory is an academic framework that focuses on the lives, cultures, and histories of marginalized groups, such as racial, ethnic, gender, and religious minorities. Rooted in disciplines like postcolonial studies, critical race theory, and feminism, Collins 12, this theory challenges dominant narratives and highlights the voices of those historically excluded from mainstream discussions. By examining works of literature through this lens, scholars and students uncover how power structures shape representation and identity. This talk explores how minority studies theory is implemented in literature using examples that foreground marginalized perspectives, challenge dominant ideologies, and embrace intersectionality. The purpose of this chapter is threefold. A. Explain the core concepts of minority studies theory in clear, accessible language. B. Summarize the most influential scholars and their contributions. C. Illustrate how minority studies theory can be applied in research and teaching. Theory, core concepts, othering and the construction of the minority. Othering is the process by which a dominant group defines itself as normal and labels any difference as strange or inferior. Stuart Hall. In minority studies theory, the term minority does not simply mean small in number. It refers to groups that are socially constructed as deviant from the norm. Patricia Hill Collins. Intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the idea that people belong to multiple social categories at once, and that these categories interact to produce unique experiences of oppression. Kimberly Crenshaw. For example, a black woman may face racism that is different from what a black man experiences, and sexism that is different from what a white woman experiences. Counter-narratives. Minority groups create their own stories to challenge dominant explanations of history and culture. Gloria Anzaldúa. These counter-narratives provide alternative ways of seeing the world and are central to MST because they reveal the agency and creativity of marginalized peoples. Cultural hybridity. Stuart Hall argues that cultures are never pure. They are always mixed, borrowed, and transformed. Stuart Hall. Hybridity shows how minorities negotiate multiple cultural influences, producing new forms of identity that resist fixed categories. Pedagogy of liberation. Paulo Freire's idea of a critical pedagogy emphasizes teaching that empowers learners to question oppression. Paulo Freire. In minority studies theory, education is a site where minority voices can be amplified and where students learn to think critically about power. Literature review. 1. Writer, Gloria Anzaldúa. Contribution to minority studies theory. Introduced the concept of borderlands to describe spaces where cultures, languages, and identities intersect. Emphasize the power of personal narrative. Key text, Borderlands La Frontera, 1990. Writer, Patricia Hill Collins. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Develop the idea of matrix of domination, linking race, gender, class, and sexuality into a system of interlocking oppressions. Key text: Black Feminist Thought, 1990. Writer, Kimberly Crenshaw. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Coined the term intersectionality, showing how the law often fails to protect people who sit at multiple marginalized positions. Key text: Mapping the Margins, Harvard Law Review, 1991. Writer, Stuart Hall. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Explained how cultural identities are fluid and constantly being remade. Argued for a cultural studies approach to power. Key text: Cultural Identity and Diaspora, 1990. Writer, Bell Hooks. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Highlighted the importance of love and relationality in feminist and anti-racist work. Advocated for an inclusive pedagogy. Key text: Teaching to Transgress, 1994. Writer, Paulo Freire. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Proposed a dialogic, problem-posing model of education that encourages learners to become agents of change. Key text: Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1970. Banks. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Pioneered multicultural education as a framework for integrating minority perspectives into school curricula. Key text: Multicultural Education, Issues and Perspectives, 2009. Writer, Luis V. Avalos. Contribution to Minority Studies Theory. Examined how language policies shape minority experiences in schools, stressing the need for bilingual and culturally responsive instruction. Key text: Language Policy and Minority Education, Journal of Language, Identity and Education, 2013. These scholars agree that power is relational and that knowledge is never neutral. Their works collectively form the backbone of minority studies theory. Methodology: How to use minority studies theory in research. Although this chapter does not present original empirical data, it outlines a simple three-step method that students can follow when applying minority studies theory to a research project. A. Identify the minorities of interest. Clarify which social groups are being studied and why they are considered minorities in the specific context. B. Apply intersectional lens. Ask how race, gender, class, sexuality, language, ability, etc. intersect for the participants. Use Kimberly Crenshaw's matrix as a checklist. C. Collect counter-narratives. Use qualitative methods, interviews, oral histories, autoethnography, to let participants tell their own stories. Look for themes of resistance, hybridity, and cultural pride. Gloria Anzaldúa, Patricia Hill Collins. When analyzing data, researchers should constantly ask, who is speaking? Who is being silenced? What power relations shape the discourse? This reflective stance is central to minority studies theory. Stuart Hall. H2. Strong. Discussion. Applying minority studies theory in the classroom. Strong. Curriculum design. UL. Multicultural texts. Include literature written by minority authors, for example, Gloria Anzaldúa's poetry and Bell Hooks' essays. P. Critical discussions. Prompt students to examine how textbooks present history from a dominant perspective, and to locate missing voices. H3. Pedagogical practices. UL. Dialogic learning. Follow Paulo Freire's model, encouraging students to bring personal experiences into academic discussion. Paulo Freire. P. Intersectional assignments. Ask students to analyze a social issue, for example, immigration policy, through the lenses of race, gender, and class, demonstrating how different groups are affected. Assessment. Instead of only testing factual recall, use reflective essays, community-based projects, and oral presentations to showcase minority perspectives. These strategies help create an inclusive learning environment where all students feel seen and valued, aligning with the goals of minority studies theory. H2. Practice. How is minority studies theory implemented in literature? Strong. A. Foregrounding marginalized voices. One key implementation of minority studies theory is centering stories from underrepresented groups. For example, Toni Morrison's Beloved, 1987, gives a platform to African American women's experiences during and after slavery. The novel's protagonist, Setha, navigates the trauma of slavery and motherhood, a narrative often overlooked in traditional historical accounts. Morrison's use of a black female perspective aligns with minority studies' goal of amplifying marginalized voices. The book is an act of remembrance that refuses to silence the traumas of marginalized communities. Trudier Harris, 89. By doing so, Morrison critiques the erasure of black women in historical and literary discourses. Challenging dominant narratives. Minority studies theory also encourages writers to subvert dominant ideologies, such as colonialism or racism. Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, 1981, critiques British colonialism in India while reimagining national identity. The protagonist Salim Sinai symbolizes postcolonial hybridity, neither entirely Indian nor British, a concept Homi K. Bhabha describes as a third space, where cultural identities blur. Homi K. Bhabha, 79. Rushdie's narrative dismantles the myths of a homogeneous national identity, a key strategy in minority studies for disrupting hegemonic power structures. Intersectionality in literature. Intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, is another vital component of minority studies theory. It examines how race, gender, class, and other identities intersect to shape lived experiences. For instance, in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, 1970, the protagonist Pekala Breedlove faces racism, sexism, and poverty, leading to her self-destruction. Crenshaw's concept helps readers understand how overlapping oppressions create unique struggles for marginalized individuals. Kimberly Crenshaw, 124. Similarly, Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, 1987, explores the intersection of ethnicity, nationality, and language for Chicana women, blending poetry and theory to articulate a multifaceted identity. Impact on literary criticism and pedagogy. Minority studies theory has also transformed how literature is taught and analyzed. Educators emphasize diverse texts to challenge the canon's Eurocentric focus. Zadie Smith's White Teeth, 2000, for example, is often used in classrooms to discuss multiculturalism in postcolonial London. The novel's multiple perspectives, Jamaicans, Bengalis, British whites, reflect on how minority studies encourages inclusive narratives. Similarly, Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, 1966, reimagines the madwoman in the attic from Jane Eyre, giving agency to a Creole woman oppressed by colonial and patriarchal systems. Diana Paul, 23. These texts foster critical thinking about power dynamics and representation. Conclusion. Minority studies theory brings together a rich set of ideas: othering, intersectionality, counter-narratives, hybridity, and liberatory pedagogy, to help scholars and educators understand and challenge the systemic inequities faced by marginalized groups. By focusing on the lived experiences and voices of minorities, minority studies theory pushes us away from a one-size-fits-all view of society and toward a more nuanced, just, and democratic world. Readers can apply minority studies theory in research by identifying minority groups, using an intersectional lens, and gathering counter-narratives. In classrooms, minority studies theory informs curriculum choices, teaching methods, and assessment practices that honor diversity and promote critical thinking. The continued growth of minority studies theory depends on new scholars who expand its concepts, bring fresh empirical evidence, and keep the conversation about equity alive across all fields of study. Minority studies theory reshapes literature by prioritizing marginalized voices, challenging dominant ideologies, and embracing intersectionality. Through works like Morrison's Beloved, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, and Anzaldua's Borderlands, La Frontera, writers and scholars reveal the complexities of identity and the impact of systemic oppression. By incorporating these perspectives into literary analysis and education, Minority Studies theory promotes empathy, inclusivity, and a deeper understanding of global histories. As students engage with these texts, they learn to question power structures and recognize the value of diverse narratives in shaping our world. Thank you.